You can feel the heat of the oil lamps flickering against stone walls. You hear the rhythm of footsteps, sandaled feet moving through a corridor lined with painted eyes that seem to watch, to judge. You smell incense mixed with something else, something human and raw. And then you see it, the symposium room where Athens' most celebrated philosophers and poets are gathering. But this is not the birthplace of democracy you learned about in school. This is the other Athens, the one they don't talk about. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It amazes me every single day that a story buried for over 2,000 years can reach someone halfway across the world, right now, through your screen. The year is approximately 420 BC. The Peloponnesian War has been grinding on for a decade. In the Agora, citizens debate the nature of justice and virtue. On the Acropolis, the Parthenon gleams with fresh paint and gold. Athens calls itself the School of Hellas, the beacon of civilization. But in the private homes of the aristocracy, behind doors guarded by slaves and sealed with wax, another world exists entirely. A world where the same men who speak of honor in daylight practice rituals in darkness that would make even their enemies recoil. We know about this world not from Greek propaganda, but from their own records. From pottery painted with scenes so explicit that museums today keep them in restricted collections. From plays by Aristophanes that shocked even ancient audiences. From philosophical texts where Plato himself describes practices involving young boys with an almost casual acceptance. The evidence is overwhelming, preserved in clay and ink and stone. The question isn't whether these things happened. The question is how a civilization that gave us philosophy and democracy could simultaneously normalize what we would today recognize as systematic abuse. Let me introduce you to a man named Critias. He's in his mid-30s, a rising star in Athenian politics, a student of Socrates, and a regular attendee at the city's most elite symposiums. Tonight, he reclines on a couch in the andron, the men's room, of a wealthy merchant's home. Around him, other citizens are drinking wine mixed with water in the Greek fashion, debating whether justice is the advantage of the stronger or something more divine. Slaves move silently between them, refilling cups. And then the entertainment arrives. A teenage boy, perhaps 14, enters the room. His hair is long, oiled, and carefully arranged. His tunic is shorter than a citizen would wear. He's been trained to play the aulos, a double-piped flute, and to move with a grace that the Greeks considered feminine. He's not here primarily as a musician. Everyone in the room understands this. What happens next is not hidden or whispered about. It's expected. It's part of what made a man cultured in Athens. The Greek word was paiderastia, literally, love of boys. We translate it as pederasty, but that translation carries our modern judgment in ways that can obscure what the Greeks themselves believed they were doing. To them, this wasn't abuse. It was education. It was how aristocratic boys learned to become men, guided by an older lover who would teach them philosophy, athletics, politics, and virtue. The older man, the Erastes, was supposed to provide wisdom. The younger boy, the Eromenos, was supposed to provide beauty and admiration. It was, in their minds, a sacred exchange. But here's where the historical record forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. The boys typically ranged from about 12 to 17 years old. The relationships were not equal partnerships between adults. They were structured hierarchies, often initiated by gifts, pressure from families seeking political connections, or outright coercion by those with power. And the practices that occurred, documented in both art and literature, were explicitly sexual. The pottery tells us what the texts sometimes euphemize. Red figure vases show bearded men pursuing teenage boys, offering them gifts of roosters or hares, standard courting symbols. Other images are far more graphic, depicting acts that leave nothing to interpretation. These weren't hidden away as shameful secrets. They were displayed at symposiums, given as gifts, exported across the Mediterranean. The Athenians were proud of these images. They represented, to them, the height of sophistication. Now, let's be absolutely clear about something historians sometimes try to obscure with academic language. This was not a homosexual culture in the modern sense. Greek men were expected to marry women and produce legitimate children. Their wives lived in separate quarters of the house, largely excluded from public life, educated only enough to manage a household. The relationships with adolescent boys existed in parallel, a separate sphere where older men sought beauty, philosophical companionship, and sexual gratification that their marriages rarely provided. It was a system that objectified both women and boys, but in different ways and for different purposes. The philosopher Plato wrote about these relationships extensively. In his Symposium, various speakers offer competing theories of love, and several celebrate the love between men and boys as the highest form. Pausanias distinguishes between common love, mere physical desire, and heavenly love, which supposedly elevated the soul. But even Plato, in his idealized version, describes relationships between adult men and teenage boys. Even in philosophy's most exalted form, this dynamic remains. Yet there were limits, and the limits reveal the underlying anxiety in the system. A boy who was too willing, too effeminate, too much like the passive partner, he risked losing his status as a future citizen. The ideal Eromenos was supposed to resist, at least initially, to preserve his honor. He was supposed to submit out of admiration for his Erastus virtue, not out of base desire. These mental gymnastics allowed Greek men to maintain that they were engaged in something noble rather than predatory. The boy's future masculinity depended on eventually outgrowing the role, taking a wife and potentially becoming an Erastes himself. But what about the boys who never wanted this? The historical record gives us fragments, glimpses of resistance. Legal speeches mention boys who fought back against unwanted advances, sometimes successfully prosecuting their assailants under laws protecting young citizens from hybris, assault, or outrage. Yes, Athens had laws against sexually abusing citizen boys. The paradox is staggering. The same culture that normalized these relationships also, theoretically, punished those who approached them wrongly. The line between acceptable pederasty and criminal abuse was real in Greek minds, but it was defined entirely by social status, consent performance, and whether the relationship followed aristocratic protocols. Slave boys had no such protections. Neither did foreign boys. The legal and social restrictions that theoretically protected young Athenian citizens dissolved entirely when it came to the unfree. For them, there was no idealized philosophical framework, no pretense of educational mentorship. There was simply use. The symposiums where aristocrats debated virtue were staffed by slave boys who could be exploited without consequence, without even the need for justification. And the truly haunting part? This system was so normalized that it became invisible to those within it. When Socrates speaks in Plato's dialogues about his attraction to beautiful young men, he's not confessing something shameful. He's participating in an accepted discourse. When Aristophanes writes comedies featuring jokes about older men chasing boys, the audience laughs because it's familiar, relatable. When sculptors create statues of adolescent athletes with idealized nude bodies, they're celebrating cultural values. The gymnasium was central to all of this. These were spaces where teenage boys exercised naked. The word gymnasium comes from gymnos, meaning nude, while older men watched and socialized. It was here that many relationships began, where an Erastes might first notice a promising boy. The wrestling and athletic training had an overtly erotic dimension that Greeks didn't try to hide. The oiled bodies, the physical contact, the competitive display, all of it fed into a system where adolescent male beauty was openly appreciated and pursued. Some modern scholars try to frame this as somehow liberating or progressive because it involved same-sex relations. but that framing ignores the fundamental issue of age, power, and consent. A 14-year-old boy in ancient Athens had no more capacity to freely consent to a relationship with a 35-year-old man than his modern counterpart does, regardless of what cultural frameworks existed to justify it. The Greeks' acceptance of these relationships doesn't make them ethical. It makes their ethics profoundly different and, in this case, profoundly wrong by any standard that values children's autonomy and protection. There's a fragment from a play, now lost except for this one quote preserved by a later writer. "The boy who refuses the man's advances is mocked by his peers. The boy who accepts too eagerly is shamed by society. And the boy who simply wants neither path has no voice at all." We don't even know the playwright's name. But that unknown author saw something in the 4th century BC that Athenian culture couldn't openly acknowledge. The system trapped the boys themselves, giving them impossible choices that were really no choice at all. The practice extended beyond Athens, of course. Sparta had its own version, the age moge, where older warriors were paired with younger trainees. Thebes had the sacred band, an elite military unit composed of male lovers, celebrated for their battlefield courage. Crete had formalized abduction rituals where men would kidnap teenage boys for months-long relationships in the wilderness, after which the boys returned as recognized adults. Each Greek city-state had variations, but the underlying dynamic remained: adult men, adolescent boys, and cultural frameworks that celebrated what we now recognize as abuse. The Romans would later adopt modified versions of these practices, though they added their own anxieties about Roman citizens being in the passive role. The compromise was that freeborn Roman boys were theoretically off-limits, but slave boys and conquered foreigners remained fair game. The practice evolved, adapted, found new justifications, but it continued for centuries. Christianity eventually helped end the open practice, not through sudden moral enlightenment, but through a different sexual ethic that emphasized chastity, marriage, and the sinfulness of all non-procreative sex. The medieval church condemned sodomy harshly, making no distinction between consensual adult acts and pederasty. The baby got thrown out with the bathwater. The genuine horror of child exploitation got mixed together with theological hatred of homosexuality in general. It would take modern society centuries more to separate those concepts, to recognize that the problem with ancient Greek pederasty wasn't the same-sex nature of the relationships, but the age and power differential. Today, archaeologists still excavate symposium rooms. Museum curators still catalog painted pottery showing Erastes and Eromenos. Classicists still translate Plato's dialogues where Socrates describes his attraction to young Alcibiades. And we're left to grapple with a deeply uncomfortable question: how do we study and teach about a civilization that gave us so much, democracy, philosophy, drama, geometry, while also practicing something so fundamentally abusive? Some scholars try to contextualize it as different times, different standards. But the Greek sources themselves reveal that even then, there was resistance, discomfort, laws attempting to draw lines. Not everyone in Athens thought the system was perfect. They just lacked the framework to imagine a complete alternative, trapped within their own cultural assumptions about gender, power, and the purpose of adolescence. The symposium, where we started, where Critias reclined with his wine and his philosophy and his expectations, ended as these evenings typically did. The men debated until dawn, growing progressively drunker, their conversation turning from virtue to bawdy jokes. The boy with the aulos played and served and eventually disappeared into a back room with someone. His name is not recorded. His thoughts are not preserved. We know the philosophers who attended these gatherings. We can read their words 2 millennia later. But the boys who served them left no writings, no testimony, no record beyond images painted on clay by those who used them. That absence is itself a kind of evidence. It tells us who had voice in ancient Athens and who didn't, who got to define what was happening, and who was simply expected to accept the definition provided by others. There's a small piece of graffiti preserved in the ruins of ancient Pompeii, written centuries after classical Athens fell, but in a cultural tradition that inherited these practices. It's just 3 words scratched into a wall. Hic ego puer. Here I was a boy. Nothing more. We don't know what experience prompted someone to carve that statement. We don't know if it was nostalgic or mournful or simply marking a fact. But it remains, embedded in volcanic stone, a ghost of a voice from someone who passed through these systems and left only those 3 words behind. The ancient Greeks gave us the foundations of Western civilization. They also gave us a mirror, if we're willing to look into it honestly, showing how even societies that celebrate reason and virtue can construct elaborate justifications for exploitation when it serves the interests of those in power. The symposium rooms are ruins now, open to the sky. The pottery sits behind glass in climate-controlled museums. The philosophical texts are studied by students who will never live in a culture where such relationships are openly celebrated. But the fundamental questions remain uncomfortably current. How do societies normalize harm? How do the powerful convince themselves that their exploitation serves a higher purpose? And how many voices are we still not hearing, even now, carved into walls we haven't learned to read? The oil lamps burned out centuries ago. The symposium ended. But somewhere in the archaeological record, in fragments we haven't yet excavated, in texts we haven't fully translated, those unheard voices wait, still silent, still bearing witness to what Athens was, behind the gleaming marble and the beautiful words.